Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our third session of the 2020-2021 Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host, Kylie Clay, and I'm the Associate Director of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University, filling in for Lauren Cooper today. We've been so pleased to lead this year's Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. The Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests with over 50 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. For today's presentation, I'd like to introduce Dylan Jenkins, Vice President of Portfolio Development at Finite Carbon. Today's session will focus on ways to enable landowners of smaller forest holdings to access carbon offset revenue, including discussion on new technologies that significantly reduce project inventory and verification costs, as well as legal frameworks that assist aligned landowners in creating pooled multi-owner projects. We're very excited to begin today's presentation, but before we do so, I'd like to briefly share a few details. To automatically receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our mailing list. Attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF. This will be automatically communicated to SAF and you will receive credit if you've registered with your information on your SAF account. If you have any questions about this, please reach out to us again at forestc@msu.edu. Attendees today are also qualified to receive 1 CEU credit from ISA in either the Management, Certified Arborist, or Municipal Specialist category. If you would like to receive ISA credits, please reach out to us at forestc@msu.edu and we will share the event code with you. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the web along with any supplemental resources such as presentation slides in the next week or so. If you've registered, you'll receive an email letting you know when and where to find these materials. This session today will be followed by Q&A. On the Zoom interface, you'll see the word chat with a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can write your questions at any point during the presentation. We'll compile those questions and then pose them to our speaker in the Q&A session following his presentation. If you're calling in on the phone but can email, you can also send questions directly to forestc@msu.edu. We'll aim to have around a 10-minute Q&A session. As we only have one speaker today, we may very well wrap up before the hour. In case of outstanding questions, we'll work with our speaker after the presentation to have these addressed, and we'll put them together in a document to be shared with alongside those presentation materials. So with that, Dylan, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
All right, thank you, Kylie. Just give me the thumbs up if you can see my presentation and hear me. All right.
Sorry, yep, we got it.
Okay, good, thank you. Well, thank you folks for joining. Really appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon for us to wrap up what's been a whirlwind tour. I mean, what a year. Hard to believe that we're into December already, and it has been a year for all of us in a lot of different ways, but in particular, you know, in the offset space and pricing carbon emissions, it's been quite a ride. Just to give you a little bit of you know, flavor or taste for what's coming. So the first part of this presentation, I'm going to dive into giving a bit of context. I think that's really important before we jump into some innovations in the space, because there's so much happening right now, not only in our space, but politically, and in ways that could, you know, impact what we're going to be doing for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about the market and to some degree the political context and pricing, and as we get into some of the innovations that are going on in the space. So like I said, I mean, what a year. Started off with a real bang, and then we got to the Ides of March, and it hit the fan. So, coming out of the gate, it really was every week. There was a new announcement by a Fortune 500 company on their commitments, their long-term commitments to reduce and ultimately eliminate their greenhouse gas footprint. This is a train that has left the station, and it's interesting times in comparison to where some of us old timers have been about 10 years ago. We'll get to that in a little bit. But back in January, February, early March, we saw BP and BlackRock and Delta and a whole host of companies coming out saying that they've made major commitments, long-term commitments to reduce or eliminate their greenhouse gas footprint. Usually 2050 is the target year, but some folks are trying to accelerate that if they can. And offsets definitely fit into that, into their greenhouse gas reduction commitment. And it's not the only thing that they do by any means, but it's a big part of it for a lot of these companies. But it's important to know on the demand side what these companies are after. And these are corporate sustainability buyers and corporate buyers that are using voluntary offsets to connect with their shareholders, their board members, their stakeholders. But it's important to know that the offsets can be contentious, that buyers are looking for, in air quotes here, quality projects with current and new ESG or environmental, social, and governance benefits. But the jury's out on exactly what that quality offset means. There's a lot of defining of that and redefining of that real time. There's articles that are coming out, including just GreenBiz a couple of days ago, that are questioning the how genuine, how credible offsets are altogether. In this case, in the quest for carbon offsets, almost anything goes. So there's a lot of noise in the space right now, and I don't mean noise pejoratively, but there's just a lot of voices that are weighing in, both on the corporate side, on the consumer side, investment side, environmental justice community, all trying to get their minds wrapped around the decarbonization of our global economy and how carbon offsets fit in. So, and then you throw layer on top of that the pandemic. I wouldn't say that we came into 2020, relatively stable, but compared to where we are now, again, everything's turned on its head. And it's interesting, again, for a company that we actually started in 2009, and how in some ways it's we've kind of come full circle, that economically there are some similarities, that over the last decade or so we've really focused more on the compliance market, but here we are back again talking about the voluntary market and that taking off. And again, the thing that's really changed, I'd say, is that back in 2008, 9, 10, voluntary offsets were more of a luxury good. And what I mean by that is that we had the Chicago Climate Exchange, we had the US that, in 2010, it was the year that wasn't. We didn't enter the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but we took a good run at it. We didn't have federal cap and trade, but we got close. Things just got quiet during that period. And it's because I don't think the consumers and corporations had as much pressure to really look at reducing and eliminating their carbon footprint to stay in business and to continue doing business the way that they do now. So I think that's the big thing that's really changed, that even in the context of the pandemic, that we do have companies that that have made this commitment, and they have turned the corner, and they are really trying to figure out how to reduce their carbon footprint and use offsets. That said, there is the COVID effect, And we've seen some of the folks like Delta and others that made major commitments early on in the year, that they're having to back off of not their long-term commitments or even their mid-term commitments, but in terms of their consumption of offsets in the near term. They're trying to keep the lights on. So we don't know exactly what's going on in terms of in the near term, how resilient is offset demand. I think that we are confident and optimistic for the mid and the long term. And it's not, I don't want to give the impression that offset purchases have dried up. They haven't by any means, but again, it's we're all trying to get through the current economic times, and as emissions go down, folks stop flying, stop consuming as much fossil fuels, emissions go down, and just the need for offsets tempers a bit, will bounce back. So that's the demand side on supply. Of course, on the supply side, why are landowners getting involved in carbon offsets to begin with? Well, it's to managing forest land sustainably is not a trivial pursuit, and it costs money to keep land sustainably managed. So both for stewardship and stability, it's to generate new forms of revenue on actively managed forest lands. And carbon projects can often be a very good fit with actively managed forest lands, certainly with lands that are going to be more conservatively managed. So often in line, carbon revenue is often in line with the mission and forest practices of many forest landowners. But also, we've seen a number of landowners of all types and demographics use carbon finance to, as part of the capital stack, to preserve and to conserve forest lands. We've done that as a company. We did a project out in Northern California where we paid for about 2/3 of the note. And that was, quite a while ago, I think back in 2015, 16, but it's not all that uncommon anymore. And if folks are trying to protect land, many take a hard look at what is the potential carbon value. So that's the supply side, but it's about connecting, these landowners with these buyers. And as you can tell, I hope from what I described, that they're almost living in two different worlds. You've got landowners that really are focused on, sustainably managing their lands, trying to keep forests as forest. And then you've got the corporate side where there's all these needs with they're trying to reduce the carbon footprint, but do so in a way that they're maintaining credibility in the way that they're doing that and using offsets, and maintaining their relationships with their stakeholders and board members and shareholders, and bridging this gap is a real art to educate landowners about what environment, what space are they entering into, and again, in the current economic context. So it's an interesting ride. We've been in business since 2009. Our company is focused exclusively on the development of improved forest management projects, and since that time, we've got about 50 projects that are under development. 33 have been registered. Most of that work over the last 10 years or so has been focused on the California compliance market. We now have a growing portfolio in the voluntary market, and I'll get to why we made that switch or semi-pivot here in a moment. But what you can see, and this is just our portfolio, but that landowners across the United States of all demographics, and obviously, there's a diversity of geographies, so there's a diversity of forest types here, have done carbon projects. And this is where there's high barriers to entry. This is mostly for compliance projects. So we're quite proud of this, but California, the compliance program has really been somewhat of a proving ground. Even if the barriers to entry have been very high, a lot of different folks have done carbon projects. And it's been a bit of a proving ground. It's been a bit of a test kitchen, if you will, which is interesting because that sort of flipped on its head where the California program really had its foundation on the voluntary space. And now we're kind of doing a switcheroo back to voluntary again with a lot of innovation in the space, which I'll get to in a moment. So our company's developed about 50 projects, and we've had 76 million tons issued. That's a lot of tons, with about $750 million of revenue generated. So this is real. This is happening at scale now. It's covering about 3 million acres, and in the California market, there's about another 3 or 4 million acres in other projects that have done. So this is starting to show up on the landscape and have a real impact. All that said, I was mentioning that we're trying to connect the landowners and help them understand what is this market that they're operating in, and really it's about helping landowners to become an informed market participant or an informed consumer. Again, that companies are making major greenhouse gas reduction commitments. That's why they're interested in offsets. But this offset market is in transition, and it's translating into a lot of different offerings for landowners, and it's quite confusing. I mean, I'm in the space, and it's kind of confusing for us, the changes and the things that are coming at us every day. What we tell landowners is that to do your due diligence is to make informed decisions and demand transparency and ask a certain set of questions of any project developer or anybody that you're going to do business with, and to answer the following questions. First of all, what is the carbon product that's being offered? Not everything is an offset. There are cost share payments for carbon reducing practices, and also annual leases for delayed harvest. So we're seeing things that are carbon offset like, but they're not all the same thing. It's a very important question to ask, because ultimately what a landowner does, they're creating some sort of unit of trade or commodity that somebody hopefully is going to compensate them and buy. And so it's very important to know what that commodity is, so they know who's going to buy and if they're going to buy. Secondly, and obviously, a question that we always get is, the landowner commitments. How does what I'm entering into align or not align with the way that we're managing our forests now? What do we have to change, if anything? What are our commitments? And then importantly, the deal structure. And this is where it gets really interesting, that there are a lot of different kinds of structures that are out there, again, depending on how what's being offered: an offset, a cost share payment, an annual lease for delayed harvest. But the sorts of things that we encourage landowners to look at is, are they getting some sort of guaranteed price and or volume for a certain period of time? Or are they being offered more of a consignment type of structure where they're being promised a certain kind of price, but they're going out to the market after a project has been developed and trying to capture potentially a higher price than they would if they were guaranteed a price at the beginning of the project? Two very different structures. Who pays the costs and when? That should be, and for how long? There are a lot of different costs that are involved with the project, as we'll get to, and it's important to know who's responsible for what. And then obviously the offtake terms, the pricing and the volume, for how long is the commitment to the program, and in parallel, how long is the commitment with the project developer and or buyer, and fees that are involved. And then finally, the program status, and by that I mean these different offerings that are coming out from folks like Finite and other developers and buyers. Is the program fully baked or still in development? And I don't say that in a pejorative sense. There's a lot of innovation that's going on in the space right now, and there should be, and that's pretty exciting. But not all of these programs or all of these pitches or structures are going to survive. So it's important that landowners know, as they're getting involved in this, is that there are some tried and true paths to connect their lands to market, and there's a lot of innovation in the space that's going on right now that we hope is going to significantly lower the barriers to entry for landowners. But we don't know. We just there's things that are going on right now that we're working on that we'll get to in a moment. So a little bit about landowner commitments, compliance versus voluntary, and this is probably a review for many of you, but just to run through it. With an eye on voluntary, and a note that, again, compliance has relatively high barriers to entry compared to voluntary. That all eyes really over the last 7 years or so, most of the activity in this space has been on the California Air Resources Board compliance program. The golden rule of any carbon project is that your harvesting is less than your growth. Or another way of saying that is that you're at least flatlining or increasing your carbon stocks across your project. One of the barriers with the compliance program, though, is that there have been some silvicultural rules that have trickled through from the Forest Practices Act into the overall protocol, regardless of what kind of forest you have and where you're managing those forests across the lower 48 and coastal Alaska. And a big one is that even age harvests have to be a maximum of 40 acres or less, 50 square feet of basal area or less. So that just doesn't make sense for a lot of landowners, especially in systems like conifer forests, where if you're regenerating a forest, you're bringing that down, and that's a lot of trees to leave to get the kind of regeneration that you want. If you're commercially harvesting your forest, then you have to demonstrate sustainable forestry practice, and that's done through one of the three major certification programs: SFI, FSC, or Tree Farm. The costs of developing a project and maintaining and operating a project are largely wrapped up in the verifications and the inventories, and the length of time that you have to commit to those monitoring, reporting, verification requirements. In the case of California, that's 100 years rolling from the last year that you've been issued an offset. Audits are required every 6 years, and re-inventories theoretically are required every 12 years, but because of the sequential sampling test that's required in verification, we know that we can't go into an audit or an on-site verification with a grown inventory. Therefore, the reality is that the re-inventories are really required about every 6 years, and that translates into very high costs that need to be set aside, or I should say some sort of fund endowment resources to cover those costs over the 100 years. Present value, if you carry those costs forward and discount those back at a conservative rate of 4%, even the smallest projects need to tuck away $300,000 to $400,000 if you're fully accounting for your costs. So that's a lot of money, and that translates into needing a very large project. For our friends in Indian country, Native American communities, they have additional hurdles or steps that they have to walk through, which include a limited waiver sovereign immunity and a BIA Section 81 review letter. For voluntary, it's a similar MRV requirements, including the ongoing site audits, which are every 5 years. In this case, re-inventory is required every 10 years. But the MRV cycle or period or the project life is only 40 years, and that's fixed. So that doesn't roll depending on how long you've been issued offsets. All that translates into needing about half the costs for monitoring, reporting, verification than it does for compliance. So most of the commitments, though, are somewhat similar. If you're actively harvesting, you need to be under one of the three major certification programs, although for the American Carbon Registry, they did just issue errata guidance between version 1.3 of their IFM protocol and a new version of the protocol that's going to be coming out that provides some flexibility on demonstrating sustainable forest management. We'll leave it at that. The other big thing too is that there are no additional harvest restrictions for silviculture. So if you're demonstrating you're using third-party certification, if you're commercially harvesting, this checks the box. So all that translates into lower barriers to entry, but you still have to have a lot of land to be able to participate in these programs. It still is, a couple hundred acres, a couple thousand acres even usually is not going to pencil out for participation and feasibility in the voluntary program. As far as forest offset project returns for compliance, it really depends on where you're at. So fundamentally, carbon offsets are a conventional forest product. And if you're managing forest, you're managing carbon. So regardless of where that goes, whether it goes into a solid wood product or pulpwood, or you're retaining it on site as carbon offsets. So all the things that impact your growth for conventional forest product is going to impact your performance as a carbon project. So in the land of milk and honey in California, in the Pacific Northwest, where you can grow a big tree in a short period of time, you can have very large windfalls of offsets early on, anywhere from $800 to $1,200 per acre upfront. And then it's a question of what is the landowner doing with their growth, their net annual growth after harvest and mortality. So, and this is assuming a historical average of about $10 per offset gross. We hit a peak of about $14 or so a year or so ago. It's back down to about $11 or $12 for California projects. So that's the sort of returns that we see for California. In voluntary, and I just put $6 to $8, gross out there as a price. We're going to get to pricing here in a moment, take a deep dive into that. But you have to, if you want to show comparative returns, you've got to put some sort of pricing up there. We look at this in terms of usually the first 5 years or so, because we don't have the windfall issuance that we do in compliance. The theory or approach to additionality is a bit different in voluntary. So what we see is on average anywhere from about $150 to $450 per acre net to the landowner total over about the first 5 years, and then about $5 to $10 per acre per year net to the landowner, again depending on what a landowner is doing with growth. Again, with voluntary, there tends to be lower barriers to entry, more forestry friendly, a better cost benefit overall. Even if not as much income is coming in, the costs are lower. And there's also more opportunity to pull projects, again, that we'll get into in a moment. And demand does appear to be picking up, notwithstanding what's going on with the pandemic. So just to wrap that up, really what's going on in the compliance market, and this wasn't by design, is that because of some changes that were made in 2017 when the California program was reauthorized, and with cap and trade and the offset program was carried on to this current decade, 2021 to 2030, they ratcheted back the allowed use of offsets by emitters from 8% to 4%, and then they said half of that demand or that supply has to come from projects that have direct environmental benefits to the state of California. So basically for landowners that are outside of California or adjacent geographies, the potential market has shrunk from what it was to about 25%. And most of that supply moving into the next decade is probably going to be supplied by projects that are already in the system and generating their annual offsets. So the California market, it's not done for projects that are outside of California, but that market is pretty much fully subscribed, and it's probably going to be pretty well subscribed for the next decade. For the voluntary space, which is where we're going to really take a dive for the next part of the presentation, you've got three major registries: American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, and Verra. They all have the similarities in terms of obviously, defining what an offset is in terms of having a project life, their verification requirements, and approach to additionality, but they all vary too. And it's important for landowners to understand exactly what those differences are. So Verra has a minimum of a 30-year project life for forestry and land use offsets. ACR has 40 years fixed. CAR has 100 years rolling, similar to the American Carbon Registry. Again, these are corporate social responsibility buyers. That again, it's not easy to predict because they're not using offsets as a commodity or an emissions obligation like they are in the California program. They're using offsets to meet an ESG type of requirement or commitment to their shareholders and their stakeholders. It's a lot harder to predict how many offsets are going to be needed even by an individual buyer, let alone across the space. So there's more sporadic demand. Often there's smaller offtake agreements. And again, we're going to dive into that because that has very important implications for what kind of deal structure a landowner might want to enter into here in a moment. Lower pricing relative to compliance, although I'll say that's quickly converging. We are seeing as compliance prices have actually come down somewhat, and voluntary offset prices, it's a very wide range, but we are getting up into that $8-10 range, that they really are starting to become on par. And then if you look at that there is some potential for some game-changing demand, although we're neither bullish nor bearish on that, but in particular the carbon offset reduction scheme for international aviation, that there potentially could be a lot of demand for offsets. Of course, there aren't a whole lot of planes in the air now compared to when there were earlier in the year. And then there's also some interesting things going on with basically crediting and paying landowners for offsets before they're actually issued. And usually when we've seen that sort of structure, the landowners really, if anytime you sell something before you actually have it in hand or you have it in your account, you're usually going to take a bath on the price. But there are certain projects, especially reforestation, afforestation projects, that you have very high capital costs, and to be able to generate income in early years is really important to get these projects off the ground. So there's some innovation here, especially with Climate Action Reserve and Vera just yesterday with their early finance carbon units, just trying to solve that issue. So, again, some interesting approaches and innovations in finance and helping generate that revenue for forest offset projects. So I want to get in real quick to just quantifying IFM project performance. And again, this is going to have an implication for what landowners get paid and when they get paid. But as we mentioned, that there's the carbon offsets, this idea or approach to additionality, it's not set in stone. Different protocols, different standards, registries have different approaches and theories of additionality. And in this case, we're talking about the American Carbon Registry and their improved forest management protocol. But always, whether you're in compliance or whether you're in voluntary, the number of offsets that you receive, it's not the total carbon that you have out on site, it's a comparison of your on-site carbon stocks versus some sort of business as usual or baseline. So that top line should be the same, regardless of whether you're developing for compliance or voluntary, are very somewhat similar. In the case of ACR IFM project performance, you compare it against a net present value maximizing scenario. And so the difference or the delta is what you're getting paid for. And so over time, a landowner is managing down to this lower level of theoretical lower level of stocking. So a landowner may, under the blue line, might be, managing and accumulating stocks. But if they were to manage more intensively, they might manage down to say 60 or 70% of the carbon stocks that they had if they weren't in the project. And one thing that I want to point out that's really important and that's starting to gain some attention by well, actually, it was just in that article that I mentioned from GreenBiz a couple of days ago, is that in improved forest management projects, there's a layer, there's basically crediting two ways. One is from the sequestration or the new or the removal credits. And you can see that in what is the landowner doing with growth. The first 5 years, that's a modest portion of their offsets. Most of the performance is actually coming from storage or avoided emissions credits from carbon that's already in the forest, but the landowner is agreeing not to harvest. So, if you were thinking about like a reforestation or afforestation project, it would all be new or removal or sequestration credits. There wouldn't be any avoided emissions credits. And it's important to point that out because some buyers don't want avoided emissions credits. Specifically, Microsoft just put a tender out about 3 or 4 months ago, and they were very clear they don't want avoided emissions credits. They only want those newer removal credits. So again, it's important for landowners to understand as they're developing, who potentially are the buyers going to be. But as you can see, this is the way that IFM projects are credited, both from avoided emissions and from sequestration credits. A note about easements and carbon additionality, because we get this question a lot. Again, that delta between what a landowner is doing in the project or under the project with the blue line and what a landowner is doing if they were not in the project, that delta is additionality. And anything that pushes that line up, like harvest restrictions that are in an easement, or if you have a portion of your property that's in a mitigation bank, they'll push that baseline up, is going to erode or eliminate offset project performance. So it's very important for folks. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of the landowners, a lot of folks that are of the mindset that they're going to do a carbon project are predisposed. They're already thinking about doing conservation easements. So the timing and the interplay of doing easements and carbon projects is something that really needs to be paid attention to. And I'll give a plug now and later on that the Land Trust Alliance just came out with 2 great publications that are written for the land trust community, but they're really good reads for anybody who's considering a carbon offset project. One is on, it's basically a Carbon 101. The other document is specifically on the interplay or the intersection of carbon projects and conservation easements. So I highly recommend that you go to the Land Trust Alliance website and check those publications out. So the voluntary carbon project development cycle, again, this is another barrier to entry that's much lower relative to compliance, is that usually it's about a 12-month development cycle. Starts out with feasibility and education. We move to listing, which is basically obtaining the building permit for a project. Move on to inventory, model and document the project, verify, bring in that third-party auditor, and then register and issue the offset project. And then depending on what your relationship is with the developer and or the buyer, ongoing support and training. So that's pretty much the way it looks, you know, regardless of what kind of project you're developing. That's the project development cycle. All right, I'm going to move on now on to pricing. And you know, we get asked this question all the time, you know, what are the prices? And for obvious reasons. I mean, that's the handle, that's the thing that most people, you know, kind of hang their hat on to try and understand what is this market about. But it's important to note from the outset that it's an important factor, but it's only one factor in depending on deriving what your overall return is going to be on a project and determining your cost benefit, if you can at all, in advance and as you enter into a contract and make a decision on whether or not you're going to do a project. The best source of information that we have is Ecosystem Marketplace for reporting. There used to be a lot of report, I think Reuters and Point Carbon and Goldman Sachs and other folks used to have reports, again, back in the day, about a decade ago. Those have largely gone away. This is not perfect information by any means, because this is all self-reported, voluntary reported information by a collection of developers and brokers and landowners, and it all goes into the pot. And so, you know, there's a lot of averaging going on here. It's also global information, but it's the best that we have, and it is a good data point. So from 2017 to 2018, you could see that for forestry and land use, there was you know, about a 3x increase in the number and the amount of volume that was transacted, but prices were pretty much static. Then about a month and a half ago, Ecosystem Marketplace came out with an interim report looking at 2019 reporting, and again, it's very incomplete at this point. But the volume was right in about what I just showed, kind of in the midpoint, and average pricing did come up. Again, take that for what it's worth. And again, this is a global average, and there's a lot of variation in that global average as far as, you know, quality and ESG and co-benefits in those projects. So, but that's one important data point. So the other thing that I'll point out, and is more on maybe on the high end, is that we're seeing, you know, more projects, you know, arrive on retail websites like cooleffect.com, Pachima, and our friends at Climeco just yesterday launched their own website. No forestry projects there, but you can see their wind farm project that's there. And so one of the reasons that I put this up, actually there's a couple of reasons, is that a lot of folks kind of have this, you know, because it's an easy handle, a $10 price point. And I think there's some accuracy to that. There's a big asterisk that we're going to get to in the next slide. But you'll see that these projects, if you are a retail buyer and doing what we call micro transactions, going to buy 1 ton or maybe 5 tons to offset an event, that you will see the pricing in the range of anywhere from $8 to upwards of $12. One of the things also that's interesting is that sometimes you'll see the same projects that are actually advertised on 2 different retail websites. In this case, the Hawk Mountain project in Tri-City. In the case of the Tri-City project, there's actually a 25% discount on Cool Effect versus what it's listed on Pachima. It's the exact same project. So it's just an interesting data point, and I raise this because landowners are out there trying to seek and find, as you know, information as they can, as are we as developers, and it's tough to come but there is no exchange for offsets. There's no place that one-stop shop where you can go and get good pricing information. We're all trying to cobble it together. So this is also another data point beyond ecosystem marketplace. You can go to these retail websites. So to put it all together on the pricing side, it's really important to understand that there's a very important relationship in the voluntary market between pricing and volume. And so, just to put that global average from ecosystem marketplace up there at $4.30 per ton, take it as you will, and looking at the gross pricing, that is a gross price, that there's a relationship. As you tend to do smaller transactions that have very high ESG benefits, you're going to be able to get a better gross price. And as you can see that when you go to those retail websites. On the other side of the spectrum, if you've got older tons that aren't forestry, but they're other land use types, and you may be able, if you're a very large buyer and you want hundreds of thousands or millions of tons, to pick those tons up at very low prices because you're purchasing a lot of volume. So that tends to be the relationship. The issue or the disconnect is that the current zone of forest offset feasibility, these projects that to just get off the ground have to generate 200,000 or 300,000 tons just to be economically feasible at a reasonable pricing range of anywhere from $6 to $8, $9 per ton. So again, you can go to these retail websites like Cool Effect and Carbon Fund, TerraPass and Pachma and see these projects that are doing microtransactions at upwards of $10 or $12 per ton. On the other side, you'll see very high volumes at low prices. The sweet spot is in this middle ground where you see low to moderate volume. And the goal is to do as few transactions as you can, because the more transactions that you do, the more you're going to pay in brokerage and friction and transaction costs, and obtain that higher moderate price. And the Goldilocks zone being trying to get move as much volume as you can with as few transactions as you can, and obtain that moderate to high price. When you even all that out, what the landowner's seeing, and again, this is cobbling together as much information as we possibly can. The question is, what is the net price per ERT or per offset that a landowner is getting across all of the volume? And again, what's the risk profile with a landowner obtaining that price? Are they doing it on consignment, or are they entering into a contract knowing that there's going to be a landowner that's going to buy all of their offsets or some portion of their offsets at a guaranteed price, guaranteed volume over a certain period of time? So this is not an easy thing to explain to landowners, but this is the way that it is. This is actually the dynamic in the space. So yeah, take it for what it's worth. So moving into what's going on as far as some of the innovation in the space. One thing is the partnership that we've recently created with the Land Trust Alliance. We've been strategic partners since 2017, but the whole point of this was to focus on the land trust community, and specifically accredited land trusts, and aggregate land trusts that on a per acre basis, they have very good yield or return, but they don't have enough acres to get to scale to cover their development, operation, maintenance costs, and generate enough return to make it worthwhile. So we've worked with the Land Trust Alliance over the last year, mainly focused on one of the big sort of quiet barriers to entry, but that's basically what's the glue. You've got multiple landowners that are coming together for 10 years, or excuse me, for 40 years or so, and it's that legal glue, and specifically a carbon operating agreement that we have now. We can work with accredited land trusts and bring them together to get to scale. And again, I want to put a plug in for the great publications that have come out somewhat in relation to this work, or aligned with this work on carbon offsets, conservation easements, and Carbon 101. So yeah, and this is the website if you'd like to return to it. So that's the Land Trust Alliance and Finite Carbon Partnership, and they also have a partnership for grasslands with Climate Trust. So visit their website if you want to learn more about those. Secondly, we're happy to introduce CORE, and this really gets into really trying to eliminate the barriers to entry for landowners. Again, there's only so much we can do about price. It's basically handed to us. The buyers are going to pay what they're going to pay. We can do as best we can to market to those different buyers, but very wide range of prices, anywhere from, again, in the mid-range being $6 or $7 per ton, upwards of $8 to $10 per ton plus. One of the things that we do have control over is reducing the costs, and the costs, as I mentioned earlier, are really around the verification and the inventory. And we've had these technologies like remotely sensed data and artificial intelligence and machine learning for quite some time, but the cost of acquisition of data has been high, and really, bringing all this together, it's a time, it's an idea whose time has come. Again, we've had these technologies for a while, but to bring them all together and put them together so that landowners can have access to these technologies and have these reduced barriers is really important. So for CORE, it's a free web-based platform for smaller lands to access the carbon market, anywhere from about 40 to 5,000 acres. We're developing a pooled owner voluntary methodology with the American Carbon Registry. We're wrapping that up right now. That should go out for public review soon. The technology, again, reduces or eliminates the landowner's measurement, monitoring, and verification costs. And it's designed, basically the Zillow of carbon, for landowners to self-enroll, or they can work with a consulting forester or regional core partner. We're looking to launch first quarter of 2021 in some select geographies. So right now we're in the process of beta testing. But basically, a landowner goes on and they receive a real-time offer, determine what portions of their property they want in and they want out. CORE is a platform. It's important to note that the first methodology that we're developing is a long-term deferred harvest methodology. Probably going to work very well for, say, bottomland hardwoods. But it's designed to absorb multiple methodologies. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but to make all of this work to begin with, we kind of had to do minimum viable product, path of least resistance. So we're starting out with what we know we can have success with, and then adding on methodologies later on. Where are we at now? The platform development is complete. We're beta testing, and the first methodology is going out for public review soon. If you want to learn more, you can go to corecarbon.com. There are other innovations in the space, and I want to make sure that I give our competitors and our friends at the Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation and Sylvia Terra, they're working on similar, trying again to reduce the barriers to entry for landowners. In the case of the Family Forest Carbon Program, this goes back to the beginning of what I was talking about. It's more of a cost share type of approach, and that's something that's very germane or familiar to landowners, that if they work with competing vegetation or do timber stand improvement types of practices, that they can get paid for that. And then that those practices are aligned with knowing or calibrated to how much additional carbon should be sequestered from that type of practice. Right now, that's being piloted in Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And again, forgive me to folks that are on the call that are associated with these programs, because I don't want to mischaracterize anything, but I do want to acknowledge that they're going on. And then Sylvia Terra with their NCAP-X, that's more of a deferred harvest approach. They're really pushing the envelope. It targets landowners of any size. It's an annual carbon lease for 1 year deferred harvest. It runs on Sylvia Terra's base map. It's an auction-based platform that's supposed to launch about the same time that we launch CORE. They do a first test run in north central Pennsylvania in 2019, where Microsoft purchased all 300 units that were produced at about $1 per unit. And again, they're looking to launch here in winter of 2021. So a lot going on in this space, a lot going on in this market, and it's important, for you as service providers and folks that provide guidance and counsel to forest landowners, to understand that all this is going on at, kind of at the same time. A little bit about hot topics and best practices. On permanence and leakage, our strong feeling is that, we don't want to return to the days of 10 or 15 years ago, that if you're going to develop a carbon offset, that it should go without saying that you're using a publicly vetted standard methodology, and preferably one under ACR, CAR, or VERA. Another issue that's coming up is additionality, and a best practice being that ensuring your baseline modeling is reasonable and justifiable. You know, there are a lot of ways to model the same project, and being reasonable with how far you're bringing down your stocking and how fast. The other really important one, and one that we've run into, and one that you'll actually read about if you open up the land trust publication on Carbon 101, is this, we call it buffer ton arbitrage, but buffer pools are required as an insurance mechanism to protect a project against unintentional reversals, force majeure events. And there is a way to dub in non-forestry, non-project offsets to release those higher value tons and basically make the spread or take advantage of an arbitrage event. Our view and our buyer's view is that is a risky endeavor in terms of the credibility and potential blowback on the perceived and real benefits of forest carbon offset projects. So we don't do it. And then layering with a conservation project, again, I'd refer you back to those documents. But if you're a land trust or you're a landowner, you know, a best practice, if you can, is to work with an accredited land trust. And not all land trusts are accredited, but one of the reasons that I mentioned that is because if a land trust has gone through the accreditation process, similar to if another landowner has gone through third-party certification, they are used to the scrutiny. They're used to going through the auditing process. They have their files and their records in order, and it's a good proxy, or it's a good litmus test to know that, you know, you've got somebody who's just already kind of wired to do a carbon project. So just started, you know, returning to where we started, you know, being an informed market participant. You know, there's a lot of different folks that are making greenhouse gas reduction commitments, but this market is in transition. Do your due diligence, make an informed decision, answer these questions, and again, you know, make an informed decision. And if you know, somebody can't answer the question, you know, keep on asking. I guess with that, I'll just give a plug that we are hiring. We're in a state of growth, and encourage folks that are in the space to take a look at. We've got 6 positions open now and more on the way. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dylan. Really interesting and informative. And we have a whole host of really fun questions here to put your way. So we'll now move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And as I said, we've been monitoring the chat as well as our email. And so we'll start with those questions first. It's not too late to get your questions in, so you can submit those in the chat box or by email to forestc@msu.edu. And again, if we don't get to your question, I apologize, but we will hope to have it addressed after this webinar. Okay, so to start out, Dylan, you've worked with diverse client organizations, including NGOs, tribal organizations, timberland trusts, corporations, and families. Are there differences from your perspective, from your company's perspective, in working with these different groups? Do some types face different additional barriers involved with getting involved in carbon projects?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, U.S. land ownership is, as you know, is extremely diverse. I think, you know, one of the things that was surprising to us early on is how quickly an early adopter the TIMOs and REITs were, but especially TIMOs, that they jumped on, you know, early in. But if you look at the context that they were making their decisions, it kind of does make sense. The prices that they had been paying at the time in 2008, 9, 10 for land, the bottom dropping out of the timber market, and carbon being there at the right time, it does kind of make sense that they did it. Chronically, though, you know, the family forest landowners have been the folks that have been left out, and again, it's because of the high barriers to entry, just the high barriers, the very expensive cost of developing, verifying, and inventorying these projects. Also, you know, these other landowners tend to have either they're very well emission aligned with a carbon project, or they're only developing a project on a portion of their overall portfolio. So in the case of land trusts, really well aligned with carbon project. In the case of TMOs and other corporate landowners, they're not putting their whole portfolio in, they're putting in the portions of their portfolio that are, are best aligned with the carbon project. For most family forest landowners, it's an all or nothing proposition. And so there's a whole another, kind of layer of psychological, kind of thinking barriers that they have to go through. Not so much a barrier, but they're putting it all in. It's a binary event, and there's really no, there's no net, there's no plan B. So I think there's that, and what I'm really glad that there is this innovation that's going on in the space right now to eliminate these barriers to entry.
Excellent, thank you. A couple of verification and calculation questions. So, are credits calculated for carbon stored in wood products removed from the site, either carbon actually stored in the wood or via substitution for more fossil fuel intensive products?
Yeah, so the former, and again, I'm going to be a little bit demure because I'm not the quant, but yes. So for long-lived wood products, for sure, there's some credit that's given, but it tends to be a de minimis, portion of the overall crediting. Most of the crediting that's coming from any improved forest management project is coming from the carbon that's being left on site.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more about how additionality is considered for an offset project if the landowner is already receiving or likely to undertake an easement? Do you only get credit for what is addition to what would be expected under that easement?
Well, it all has to do with what the easement says about silviculture. It's a great question. And so, if you were to go back to our project map, for example, there are 50 projects that are on that project map. And about 14 or 15 of them have a conservation easement that actually predates the carbon project. So you'd ask, what's the additionality? Well, all of those easements, or I should say none of those easements restricted harvesting completely across the project. Now, in some cases, there was some harvest restrictions or silvicultural restrictions on, for say, example, wider than regulatory minimum SMZs, or you can't harvest for view sheds, above a certain, along property boundaries or above a certain elevation. But beyond that, a landowner could manage their stocking down to some baseline, business as usual level. The easement didn't restrict that. So it really has to do with what the conservation easement says about what a landowner can and they can't do in terms of harvesting. If it's a straight non-development easement, the landowner simply can't subdivide and build, convert forest land to non-forest use, then it should have no impact on the improved forest management project. As a matter of fact, even if the easement says that the landowner must be third-party certified, again, if there's no restrictions on silviculture, or there's no minimum stocking requirements, it shouldn't have an impact on the performance of the carbon project.
Okay, and unfortunately we are running low on time here, so I'll just ask one last question regarding changing administration here. What happens if the Biden administration develops a federal carbon bank that buys carbon credits from landowners in return for demonstrated management practice or sustainable management practices? How does that influence your projects? How does that influence the role finite carbon plays? What uncertainties are we facing here?
Yeah, more, I suppose. But our company got started in 2009, and so we had all of the same questions. Remember, again, for those that have been in the space long enough, 2010 was supposed to be a big year. Again, that's when we were looking at entering the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's when we got close to doing, having a federal price and a cap and trade program. It's also the year that the Chicago Climate Exchange imploded. So there's, we've been through these sorts of questions before, and guaranteed, if you're in this space long enough, things are going to change. It's very tough to predict what's going to happen with the incoming administration, without getting, trying to remain apolitical. What I can say is that, the Biden administration is going to have a hard enough time doing, the basic things that they want to do. Getting, like federal cap and trade or a price on carbon is would be an extreme lift. So, I mean, we could go to the specific question about, if there's, a federal carbon bank. What I'd say is that there are, you can look to places like British Columbia, other jurisdictions where you have multiple ways of pricing carbon that exist in alignment. And it's all about, the micro decisions that are made about, what industries are being capped, which ones aren't. But in some cases, you can have a carbon tax and you can have a cap and trade type of program that work in alignment. So sorry to sort of sidestep that question, but that's a really specific question that I really wouldn't even want to venture into on answering that. What I will say is that what our feeling is that the way that we've been, where we've been for the last 4 8 years or so, where jurisdictions, states, cities, having to fill the gap and be innovative and do kind of figure this out is probably the direction that we're going to continue. Notwithstanding the great work that the Forest Carbon Working Group has done and the policy platform that's come out to try and guide the investments that are going to be made, that can be made, that we hope are made to reward landowners for carbon practices. But in terms of kind of a game-changing type of solution, I don't think we foresee.
Well, with that, I will thank you very much to everybody for joining today. And of course, a very special thank you to our guest, Dylan Jenkins. Again, the webinar recording and any supplemental materials will be posted shortly. If you'd like to be included on our mailing list to receive registration details for upcoming webinars, please email forestc@msu.edu. And Dylan, thank you once again for your time and your willingness to impart your expertise on all of us. I hope that everyone has a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly.